How nice of you to join me. This is a collection of videos I've done from 2018 onwards, based on 16 and 18-bit adaptions of movies, most of them that did really badly. Will there be another collection like this? Once I've done enough of them, yes, but until then, listen to me from the past talk about movies from even longer ago. Yes.
I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm James Bigglesworth. My friends call me Biggles.
Hooray for Hollywood. Yes, we're about to start a series based upon movies that tanked at the box office and those video games associated with them. Video games were plentiful in the 1980s, but publishers were keen to give themselves an extra advantage where they could, and brand recognition was certainly helpful. Be it sports stars like Gary Lineker or Daley Thompson, cartoons like Garfield or Top Cat, arcade conversions like Double Dragon or Rolling Thunder, or even TV quiz shows like Pop Quiz or Krypton Factor. That small piece of name recognition of a known franchise or property can give you the advantage over the Monty Moles and Minor Willies of this world. And movies were no exception, with certified guarantees like 1990's Batman the movie and 89's Ghostbusters 2 destined to bring money into the pockets of both movie studios and software houses, regardless of the quality of either product. But it wasn't always risk-free, however. RoboCop was a gamble for Ocean, an unknown quantity. Unluckily, the movie ended up being a critical and commercial success, and the game was pretty good too, seeing it rooted to the top of the games chart for some time. Other movies like Navy SEALs or Nightbreed didn't end up being quite as successful when released for cinema-going audiences, and so the resultant video games struggled to perform, even though both were above-average games. Biggles on the ZX Spectrum was one such title, chocks away what. James Bigglesworth, otherwise known as Biggles, was a fictional British World War I pilot written by author W.E. Johns, because for some reason authors hate their Christian names. I don't know why. He made his first appearance in the first issue of Popular Flying magazine. Sounds great, doesn't it? In a story called The White Fokker. That's Fokker, as in the German plane, you gutter-minded brutes. W.E. Johns would go on to make stories until his death in 1968, with the series of Biggles spanning nearly 100 volumes. In 1986, the movie version of the titular hero was released, but with a twist. Rather than just being a straight World War I epic, the movie was given a time-travelling element, where Biggles' time twin, I don't know what one of those is, a New Yorker called Jim, falls through a time hole to 1917 and assists Biggles with the war effort against the Germans and their dreaded sound weapon. Ooh. Despite a royal premiere that had both Prince Charles and Princess Diana in attendance, Biggles tanked at the box office, making just a piffling $100,000 return on a $7 million budget in the States. Although it should be added that it was released a good 2 years later than in the UK. Not only was it received poorly by audiences, but critics weren't a fan either, with David Robinson of The Times concluding the script was witless, the direction showy, and the lead performances weakly amiable. So not a great 80s return for Biggles then, a movie also noted as being the last movie of Peter Cushing, who died shortly afterwards. And so we come to the video game. Released in 1986 for the 8-bit systems, Biggles' Adventures in Time was released by Robert Maxwell's Mirrorsoft and developed by Delali Software. Split into multiple parts, the first is certainly the most Bigglesy, as you're in an actual warplane, blowing up Fokkers. That's still Fokkers as in the warplane, by the way, you cheeky buggers. It's a perfectly competent early Spectrum side-scroller. There's an issue with the control in that you've got to tap fire to shoot your machine guns and hold it down to blow up installations with bombs. It's a bit of a fiddle in all honesty, and it's not something you want to do when you're trying to emulate Biggles and show off to young girls. There's lots of attractive women into Biggles these days, obviously. Of course, this will lead to a ton of errors, but you know what? It's not the end of the world. If you get shot down, you don't die, you leap through time. And you play the second game, and the flyboy is on the battlefield and pumping Jerry full of lead. You can duck through caverns, blasting and grenading with gay abandon. It's possibly the best game of the selection. Another ball's up from you, and you'll be leaping into the far distant future of 1986. Here, Jim and Biggles have to draw fire from each other as they leap from rooftop to rooftop. This is a pretty ingenious concept for an early game, to be fair, and a testament to how much thought was put into the game as a whole, along with the time-switching mechanic, unusual for a film license of the time. But it's also sadly the second worst level of the game, down to the absolutely abysmal detection between the feet of our heroes and the platforms they're supposed to be leaping onto, leading to countless frustrating failures. If you do manage to finish all three of the main games, you're given a password with which to access side 2 of your purchase, where you can pilot a Met Police helicopter in 1917 because of all the timey-wimey stuff. You've got to pick up all your chums who sound like previous champions of a public schoolboy soggy biscuit competition, Algie, Ginge and Bertie. After that, it's on to blow up the sound machine. Despite its grandstand finish position, it's the least fun part of the game. That might be a personal preference possibly, as I'm always likely to struggle to find much enjoyment from ZX Spectrum flight sims in 2019. Fairly mixed reviews from the magazines saw a 7 out of 10 from Your Sinclair, 4 out of 5 from Sinclair User, a 63% out of 100 from Crash Magazine. Yes, at the time, all three magazines employed a different type of scoring system. So that's it, old boy. What we have here is a movie conversion a little less than wizard, but some way worse than a wing full of lead. What? In 1991, Bruce Willis was big news at the box office. Coming off the success of his turns in TV's hit Moonlighting, as the voice of a talking baby in Look Who's Talking 1 and 2, and, of course, that pair of alleged Christmas movies, Die Hard 1 and 2, everything Willis touched was rubbed by the palm of Midas himself, if you ignore Bonfire of the Vanities. So surely, teaming him up with the mega Hollywood producer Joel Silver and the director of the critically acclaimed Heathers, Michael Lehman, would ensure another golden plaque upon the Willis mansion toilet wall, covered with gems and stuff, with a big title that said Hudson Hawk is the bomb, which they would all gather around him and Demi Moore. I don't know if they were together then, but they'd gather around and they'd look at it and they go, that's magnificent, what a great movie Hudson Hawk was. I don't really know how these film types celebrate success. Maybe they just eat a bowl of curry in front of like Bargain Hunt or something. Well, the answer to that meandering question is no. It wasn't a success, which is why it's on a video about games based on flop movies. Hudson Hawk was a slapstick-heavy comedy about the eponymous Eddie Hudson Hawk Hawkins and his cat burglar ways. All Eddie wants on his first day out of prison is to have a nice cup of chino, or a cappuccino. Unfortunately, he is blackmailed before he can wrap his lips around the cup by a mafia family, the CIA, and his own parole officer, blackmailing him into doing a variety of dangerous art heists with his singing partner in crime, Tommy Five-Tone Messina. There ensues a lot of them singing and trying to break into stuff. It's all part of a bigger plot by a sinister corporation to build an invention designed by Leonardo da Vinci that turns lead into gold. These bloody alchemists. Gold is a hussy. Lead is the metal you want to marry, even though it poisons you. It does it out of love, though. Abusive love from metal. Maybe gold is better then. Richard E. Grant was right all along.
We've got the real deal. Money will always be paper, but gold will always be gold.
The movie was not well received by critics, as proved by its 26% Rotten Tomato score and its 3 Razzies. Ouch. Audiences were also nonplussed with Mr. Hawke's chicanery, with the box office taking just $17.2 million in ticket sales from a budget of $65 million. Tank-a-rooney. People were way more interested in seeing Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs at this point. Ocean Software, never scared of an unknown movie property, as evidenced by their rightful backing of RoboCop, stomped up the cash for the Hudson Hawk license for release in 1991 to go alongside the movie. They clearly had lofty hopes for the success of the film, as they commissioned Liverpool coders special effects to make the game for the Amiga, the Atari ST, the Commodore 64, the Amstrad CPC, and the Spectrum, with Sony ImageSoft handling the US distribution for versions for the NES and the Game Boy. Special effects were highly regarded at the time, featuring the talents of coders such as Jonathan Joffa Smith and James Bagley. They were behind the incredible Spectrum version of Midnight Resistance, along with excellent titles such as The Untouchables, RoboCop 2, Cabal, and Batman the Caped Crusader. As was the tradition of the Ocean movie license, Hudson Hawk was a side-scrolling platformer. It didn't really follow the movie particularly well, and special effects chose to use super-deformed Bruce Willis and make him into a cutesy character with an oversized head. I don't actually mind the look of the game, as although Hudson Hawk is a cool character in the movie, the rest of the production is a surrealist and whirlpool of complete nonsense.
Sprinkler system set up in the back. Can you fucking believe it? Yeah, that's probably what happened.
I think its silliness sits pretty well. The game really plays up to the ridiculousness of the movie, with killer Dachshunds, rhinos causing havoc in the Vatican, killer nuns, and defecating birds that crap on you from above, that can all be damaged by just Hudson Hawk's useful array of weapons, the baseball and the boxing glove. Yes. I think that the look of the game and its general direction for capturing the feel of the movie, rather than the look of it, is perfectly acceptable. It's an oddball, bizarre treatment that makes me think that Ocean saw what was brewing with the movie and just went, you know what guys, just do what you want. Put out a good game. Fine. It's a game that requires a bit of play to get used to its little quirks. Sometimes there are some quite tricky puzzles, and it's got some quite janky inertia in its control system. The gameplay encourages you to keep moving, but to plan ahead at times, and to avoid various perils like spring-loaded traps and guard dogs that will return you to the start of the level, which can be very frustrating. All in all, it feels like a very European platform game, which is why I think it works better on the home computers than on the Nintendo consoles. There are undoubtedly classic platformers on the computer formats of the time that still stand up today, but there was a definite polish, attention to detail and control method, level and character design in platform games that Capcom, Konami, Sega and Nintendo had that the European and American software houses of the time just didn't have. That extra button for jumping on the Nintendo consoles helped, of course, as did probably the larger teams compared to the minimum amounts of staff and sometimes just bedroom coders of the 8 and 16-bit era on the computers. Which is why, although Hudson Hawk is an excellent computer platformer, it's merely mediocre on the NES and the Game Boy, despite being the same game as the others. Magazine reviews reflected this, with all three major Spectrum magazines actually singing Hudson Hawk's praises in unison for a change, along with very positive reviews in Atari ST User, Commodore Format, Zap and Ace. The Nintendo ones, they've not been remembered in a great light, with famous internet game critic Sean Baby rating it as the 17th worst game of all time, and Defunct Games giving it a rough time in their review. My review, it's okay. Having experienced the best of both worlds of the 8-bit computers and the NES as a kid, I can appreciate Hudson Hawk for what it is, but understand the criticism from those who had the likes of Mario and Mega Man in their lives as children, instead of Monty Mole and Minor Willy. Oh, and spoiler, he gets his cappuccino at the end. Clive Barker is the Scouse Stephen King. Maybe he'd go up to Stephen King and go, "Hey, Stephen, calm down, lads. You don't have to make the children in it shag to get out of that magic sewer, mate." Sorry about my impression, people from Liverpool. He's perhaps a little more Marmite than King, and has a much, much worse bad book to good book ratio than Maine's finest author. When Clive is good, though, he's great. In 1988, Clive Barker penned the horror novel Cabal, the story of a troubled mental patient, Boone, who is falsely led to believe by his doctor that he is a serial killer. Boone goes on the run and ends up seeking refuge in an old abandoned cemetery that just so happens to be filled with various beasts, creatures and monsters called the Nightbreed. That's the name of the game. Wow! Clive rather fancied the idea of this story as a movie, and so he decided to make it himself. And just like Maximum Overdrive, directed by the aforementioned fellow author King, it wasn't a good idea. However, having said that, unlike King, Barker had directed a genuinely good movie, again based on his own works, Hellraiser. We've all heard of Hellraiser. Look at that man with the pins in his noggin. So what went wrong? Well, number one, it wasn't as good as Hellraiser. But it wasn't terrible. According to Rotten Tomatoes, 40% of critics awarded it a positive score, with many critics praising the concepts but not Clive's directorial delivery. Another issue Nightbreed had was with the studio Morgan Creek. Breed's final edit upon release was not loved by Clive Barker, as it was heavily butchered before release, and it has taken until this year for Barker to release his favoured version, known as the Cabal Cut, which is coming out on Blu-ray. The Cabal Cut restores a lot of the lost footage, and it has been re-edited by Clive Barker himself. But suffice to say, Clive Barker was not happy with the original 1990 release. Unfortunately, Morgan Creek also botched the marketing. Thanks to Friday the 13th, Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, the slasher genre was very popular by the time of Nightbreed's release in 1990. Morgan Creek had edited the trailer to look like a slasher film, hiding both the Nightbreed creatures and the film's central conceit, that mankind is capable of terrible violence and that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, in the case, of course, of the Nightbreed monsters, who are a benevolent race, largely apart from the berserkers. Ultimately, Nightbreed struggled to make back its $11 million budget, clawing just $8 million back in North America. Low budget, low target, it still failed. Poor old Clive and poor old Ocean 2, as their scattershot licensing hit another clanger. You unfortunate Muppet Wallies, Ocean. Only this time Ocean had gone big. They'd actually committed to 3 games based on Nightbreed. Oh good lord. When the movie ultimately tanked, Ocean backed the chuff up on the 3rd game, an Ultima style RPG, but unfortunately work was well underway on the other 2 titles to stop production. The other 2 games are Nightbreed, the interactive movie released for the Amiga, MS-DOS and Atari ST, and Nightbreed, the action game, released for the aforementioned 3 formats, along with 8-bit computers, the Amstrad CPC, the Commodore 64, and the good old ZX Spectrum. The interactive movie is a mixed and varied bag, following the plot of the movie pretty closely. The interactive movie game is comprised of different levels, usually little sub-mini games, but the main part of the game is viewed through a Dungeon Master style window. It's an ambitious but not tremendously pretty game of this type. There's a car-based section where you view this little car from above and make it move about, a fighting sequence, a joystick waggling escape from a monster, and a sizable plummet down a big hole towards the end of the game. On the whole, it's an admirable go at something different, with magazine The One giving it a 75% score at the time, and it's not aged well, especially compared to similar games of the type, like It Came From the Desert. It lacks a lot in terms of replayability, and it's very much a curio from the past as opposed to a legendary movie conversion. The action game has a real feel of Shadow of the Beast to it, as Boone is pursued by the villainous Dr. Decker and his neo-Nazi Sons of the Free sect, along with some of the more feral Nightbreed creatures known as the Berserkers. In the film, Boone is turned into a Nightbreed himself, and he must find a passkey, a token that opens a pathway to Midian, as this is the alt world of the Nightbreed, which he, of course, is now one. The game suffers a little bit from its large sprawling map, with locations that look very similar. You move left to right and in and out of the screen, and it really does become quite labyrinthine. But you walk around these places brawling with zombies, avoiding bombs and blasting some of the bigger berserker monsters with pistols. It's an enjoyable attempt and preferable overall to the interactive game. A range of reviews from the magazine settle down roughly in the average territory, with a few others here and there being outliers, much like the Nightbreed themselves, giving it high and very low rankings. The Nightbreed then, what a bunch of uggos. I bet they still get more swipes than me on Tinder. Okay, thanks, bye! It's Halloween, so all retro YouTube gamers, by the order of Google themselves, have to fight over which video games from the past 30 years to play. As a bottom of the barrel talent, I guess I don't get to play the good ones like Silent Hill, Resident Evil 4, Zombies Ate My Neighbours, or even Friday the 13th 2017. No, I know my place, and my place is playing the absolute drizzling bum fudge. And with Domark's Friday the 13th for the Spectrum, you don't get much wetter or more arse-candly than that. Okay, so there's nothing actually stopping me from playing like Castlevania or Ghouls and Ghosts or Silent Hill 2 or anything, other than my own need to self-harm in a digital manner. But if I didn't do that, then we wouldn't have this unnecessarily long and pointless intro either. And that just won't do, will it? Look, you've seen some game footage now. Now I can talk about the franchise itself. Friday the 13th was an iconic franchise throughout the 80s and 90s, spawning 10 mainline movies, a remake, a versus spin-off with fellow slasher Uggo, Freddy Krueger, and even a TV series. There is little doubt that the violent, remorseless giant zombie Jason Voorhees was a bankable murderer, and no mistake, despite the relatively low quality of most of the entries, particularly in the main movie line. Jason and his mother, the actual antagonist from the first film, had a real slaughter boner on for American teens, be they Crispin Glover, Kevin Bacon, or even a young psychopathic bald Corey Feldman, across a variety of locales from Crystal Lake Camp to New York and even space. It's very spooky space, isn't it? Yes, that iconic mask. Well, he didn't play a lot of ice hockey in that, but I'll tell you what, $466 million over 12 movies. That sure is big business. Keep on slashing, Jason, old boy. There's money to be made in them there decapitated heads. Probably the least illustrious of the games based on the franchise, those being the aforementioned 2017 game, an utterly fantastic and true to the source material handicap multiplayer game, and, of course, the NES title that was big on ideas but not so great on execution. The one we're talking about here is Friday the 13th on the ZX Spectrum, which also came out on the Amstrad and Commodore 64. It was released by Domark in May 1986. Domark, a company with a mixed reputation when it came to quality control on the Spectrum, launched a huge marketing campaign, well, for the time anyway, to go with the game's release. The Commodore 64 and Amstrad titles had extra sounds recorded on the tape. They were sounds of horror. The first 5 correct guesses of what those noises were got the guessees, is that a word? A handsome Eureka monitor for all those colour graphics that are displayed on there. This wasn't part of the Spectrum deal, but when you look at the game you can kind of see why. I mean, sometimes less is more, isn't it? Look at that. It's uglier than a baboon's scrotum, so it is. Other little marketing pictures included something here from Crash Magazine, who said in their review of the game that they were sent numerous rubber weapons and other gruesome scars as promotional gifts. Finally, all copies of the full price game included 2 fake blood pellets. I'm not sure what exactly you're supposed to do with these. Maybe you bite into them when you get killed in the game. That's real immersive gameplay, that. Take that, VR. Yeah, you can't top that, can you? Fake blood coming out your mouth when you get killed by that Jason Voorhees there. Yeah. Add to that marketing blitz a ton of other competitions and endless adverts in the magazines of the time, and you can see that the full force of Domark's marketing team were behind this potentially lucrative license. The programming team, they were a little bit slacker though, compared to the marketing team. You see, Friday the 13th is one basic bitch. Literally, it looks like it was programmed in BASIC. The premise of the game sees you cast as one of the ill-fated camp counsellors. Here are a selection of them. Holy moly, they're a lot better looking in the movies, these teens, I tell you. Your MO is to find a sacred cross, then place it in a safe sanctuary inside one of the few scattered buildings around the play area. Then you have to sort of hover around the counsellors and herd them like sheep, and escort them to said cross. I guess they must be a little bit religious, before too many are cleaved apart by Jason Voorhees. You win the level by taking him down by using one of the many weapons that the messy, mass-murdering malcontent leaves lying around. It's your own fault, Jason, you big galoot. Clean up after yourself. Oh, all these murderers leaving blood around. honestly. Slay him, and much like the movies, he rises again, and so you have to go through it all over again, so the ordeal never ends. So you can probably tell that this game is rough. Rough like sandpapered cat's tongue. The controls are janky in the extreme. To slash at Jason, you have to hit fire and left or right depending on the direction that he's coming from, and hope you don't screw it up by dropping the weapon. If you do that, kiss your arm or another part of your anatomy goodbye, as you're about to become separated from them forever. Programming shortcuts are abound in this game. You can get stuck on the scenery, so mind how you manoeuvre around the looping flip screen map of Crystal Lake. As you can see, and as previously covered, the game is an eyesore too. This isn't a giant key, it's a chainsaw. I spent ages trying to get the tractor to work with it. Maybe that's on me, clearly that key does not fit in that tractor. However, it doesn't look much like a chainsaw either. Jason never appears as himself either. He disguises himself as one of the teens to lull them into a false sense of security before he gets knifey. Now, while I accept that for the conceit of this game to work, this has to happen, it really does not fit or work with the character of Jason Voorhees. Here are some of the counsellors from the movie franchise. Yeah, he can't exactly be pulling off that hot cheerleader look, what with his lake-withered flesh, multiple old stab contusions, rotten face, and 7-foot-tall wrestler frame. I think perhaps Domark should have had a little rewatch of the movies before committing to this idea. The game really does have a hugely rushed feel to it. You can rack up points by standing on the corpses of your fallen friends, just as you can by standing around them when they're awake. I can confirm that this does not work. I went to the local mortuary, I stood on the body of a recent car crash victim, and I can confirm that I was taken away in cuffs. At no point was I given extra points. I do these things for you so you don't have to do them. I'm a scientist now in prison. There are also 3 status bars that indicate your levels of panic, strength and sanity. These seem more like remnants of a more developed, grander idea, but one that's been ultimately rushed out of the door. And it's not just me, the magazines all slated it too. Crash gave it a 32% in its issue 29. Sinclair User gave it a 2-star rating out of 5 in their April 86 edition. And your Sinclair said, here's a 3 out of 10, sunshine, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Friday the 13th is ultimately frustrating because I can see what they were trying to do. But it's rushed, it's not in the least bit scary, and it's just simply not very good. Don't it out. That was a little play on a little sound clip they play throughout the movies. It's really good when you have to explain jokes. I find that's the best way to end an episode. Death Wish 3 is the 3rd movie in the 5-movie plus 2018 remake franchise, following vengeful vigilante Paul Kersey, played by Charles Bronson, who looks a lot like a moustache drawn on a pebble. Can you guess what the 2 movies before were called? Can you? Aren't you clever? Death Wish 1 and 2, well done. Death Wish 3 was directed by Michael Winner in his 3rd and final movie in the franchise. The Death Wish franchise was undoubtedly his biggest success, and most of his other work flopped critically and commercially. Winner had some controversy behind the scenes as well. His then lover, a jobbing actress called Sandy Grizzle, features in a scene where the gang attempts to rape a woman. Shortly before the movie's release, Sandy Grizzle sold her story to British tabloids, telling the papers how Michael Winner had used her as a sex slave and had whipped her around his bedroom. That's the sort of stuff that only Hollywood moguls can get away with, kids. Don't treat people as sex slaves. The film production struggled with its budget and was eventually moved from its setting in New York to being filmed in the much cheaper London. Actors and actresses hired when relocated ended up being British, and so had to be overdubbed by not actors but US military personnel stationed at High Wycombe Air Station. This obviously leads to some terribly delivered lines. These people are military people, they're not actors. Their delivery could be compared to how I do a video, for instance. Fans of late 80s and 90s properties will want to keep an eye out for Bill from Bill and Ted and Councillor Troy from Star Trek The Next Generation in early roles that I would imagine probably don't feature very highly in their CVs. Death Wish 3 currently reports a dismal 6% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is an absolutely miserable average score indeed. And so, with that in the bag, we know it is a terrible movie. Let's move on to the video game. Death Wish 3, the video game, was published by Gremlin Graphics in 1987, some 2 years after the movie, but the same year that the VHS was released, on the MSX, the Amstrad CPC, the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum. Made by the in-house team of Sean Hollingworth, Peter Harrop, Chris Kerry and legendary 8-bit maestro Ben Dalglish, Death Wish 3 is an ambitious action-adventure title indeed. You are cast as Bronson's Paul Kersey as he battles his way through the dilapidated neighbourhoods riddled with crime. Rather than being a straight-up left-to-right shooter with different stages, Death Wish 3 is a free-roaming adventure with explorable interiors, innocent bystanders, a different game that can be accessed by approaching the nearest window, gratuitous hyperviolence, and a police force that will either assist you or attack you depending on how you interact with them. Like I said earlier, Death Wish 3 was very ambitious. These are concepts not of an 8-bit computer game, but perhaps a couple of game console generations later. This is the sort of thing I would expect to see on a PlayStation 1 or 2 game. Does it deliver on the ambition? Not entirely, but it makes a reasonable attempt and works with what it has, which is a set of computers with the processing power today of a wristwatch you buy off Wish.com or a £25 microwave. The initial encounter you will have with Death Wish 3 will be utterly baffling. The concept of a 3D world in an 8-bit computer using 2D sprites is done by you, the gamer, rotating the environment using the up and down keys. It's completely bizarre to get to grips with and utterly unintuitive. Once you do get used to using the map and the compass at the bottom of the screen, you'll be less like the little 4-year-old who's lost his mum in the aisles of Sainsbury's and more like the grizzled 44-year-old retail assistant veteran who moans in front of customers about Sandra's preferential treatment when it comes to getting Saturdays off. Your main task is to enter buildings and find the heavily guarded gang bosses. You put a bullet in their head and subsequently you'll weaken the gang influence in that area of the city. You will get regular updates via this dot matrix printout of riots to tackle in different areas. The riots usually mean that in one of the buildings nearby, one of those gang bosses will reside. And then you can put a bullet in the head of these rather relaxed rebels. While you're in there, you can have a look out the window and snipe people in the street, just like my mum used to do, who's now in prison for life. I miss my mum. The buildings are also good places to top up your munitions, which range from machine guns to shotguns, from pistols to a god-darn bazooka. The game does not hang about when it comes to the bazooka. It sets it as your default starting weapon. One slap of the fire button and whatever is in front of you, be it a truncheon-wielding thug, a policeman, or even a handbag waving innocent granny, is reduced to a rough rib cage filled with red paste. Make no mistake about it, Death Wish 3 is definitely a title designed for the movie's target audience of 18 pluses, given its unusually hyper-violent nature for a game of the time. It's not just the violence though that puts the game ahead of its time either. As previously stated, the environment is fully explorable and the police react to your actions, but it's also the little details too. Ambulance workers, for some reason clad in surgeons' long coats, come along and drag bodies away, even if it means scraping up the visceral scar left by a bazooka shell. The grannies will also bonk anything that they don't like on the head, and the street workers will flash a single buttock at passers-by in order to attract men to stick their fingers up a bum for less than my charge of £600. Reviews? Well, they were surprisingly mixed for what I think is a terrific little title. CNVG and Your Sinclair both praised the title to high heaven. CNVG called it technically excellent with brilliant graphics, declaring it an excellent game that is shockingly realistic. I'm not sure I agree with it being realistic, but then I've never been to New York, so I have no idea if people get regularly blown up by bazooka shells, or if the entire population of New York is made up of policemen, prostitutes and grannies. Your Sinclair said that for once the word tie-in isn't the kiss of death. This is a shoot 'em up with a difference and is packed with clever touches. Sinclair user called it outrageously violent with occasional touches of humour. They weren't quite as into it as everyone else, saying that there's not enough gameplay variety to hold interest though, and gave it a 7 out of 10. Crash Magazine though, what are you smoking, guys? They gave it a lowly 45% and said the attractive appearance doesn't compensate for the unexciting gameplay. So in spite of what Crash said, if you've ever wanted to play a really good video game based on a really terrible movie, you'll struggle to find a bigger disparity between a movie and its adaptation than Death Wish 3. Please, by all means, give it a go. As the UK's self-appointed leading below 100 subscribers authority on games based on flop movies and Hulk Hogan references, it was only a matter of time before I stopped ignoring this, pointed my irises directly into its code and went, alright then. So here then is a look at Alternative Software's game adaptation of 1991's Suburban Commando. Hulk Hogan vehicle par excellence. Actually, it is one of his better films, which isn't saying much. Rocky 3 forever! Suburban Commando the movie sees Hulk Hogan in his hot dog coloured tan pomp, cast as intergalactic gladiator Shep Ramsey. At the very beginning of the movie, we find Shep, who is tasked with rescuing the kidnapped President Hashina, who is the ruler of an entire planet, much like Vladimir Putin. The kidnapper is General Suter, who just happens to be the film's big bad, but he's also, secretly, a big reptile in disguise. Just as David Icke keeps prophesying, and we don't listen to David Icke. We should listen to David Icke. There are reptile people. I don't believe that really, but let's pretend I do for this review. Anyway, he beats down Shep during this rescue attempt and badly wounds him, and he also kills the president in the process. Shep escapes, a bit wounded, but he has a tantrum as well, and he smashes up his own ship, and this forces him to crash land. And already I'm thinking that this guy is possibly the most incompetent otherworldly superhero ever. The film's barely started and you're sending Hulk Hogan up as a chump. What are you doing? So anyway, when he crash lands on Earth, we end up in the usual fish out of water comedy plotline, so better used by comedies like Coming to America or Crocodile Dundee. Shep ends up living with the family of weak-willed company man architect Putz, Charlie Wilcox, played by Christopher Lloyd, him of course being Doc Brown. Also in the cast are Shelley Duvall and Mark Calloway, better known by his wrestler moniker The Undertaker, who incredibly in 2020 still wrestles despite now being older than most of the people real Undertakers put in the ground. New Line Cinema acquired this masterpiece of a script after it was rejected in 1988 by the duo of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito, as they decided to make twins instead. Clearly this was the better choice, as we ended up with Arnold Schwarzenegger singing Yakety Yak on a plane, and it sounds ridiculous, and I love it. Directed by veteran Western director Burt Kennedy, a strange choice for a modern-day set action comedy, Suburban Commando duly tanked. It made just $8 million domestically off an $11 million budget and was hit by multiple negative reviews. The Rotten Tomato approval rating is currently 15% off of 13 reviews. Isa stinker. It is exactly the sort of film that an under 10 though will probably like and sit through and enjoy, much like how my 6-year-old son keeps seeing posters of Sonic the Hedgehog in the cinema and insists that I take him to go and see it. I do not want to go and see it, it looks awful. The movie, while performing pretty miserably at the cinema, did okay on VHS, and it was that, combined with the tail end of the peak of Hulkamania, and no doubt a cheap licence, that persuaded Alternative Software to get their in-house team to put together a computer game, which was eventually released for the MS-DOS, the Commodore 64 and the Amiga 2 years later in 1993. I will be concentrating on the Amiga version today because, well, it feels kind of familiar. Those sprites, the animation. Wait a minute, is this made with the same engine as Allo? It does seem that is the case. Alternative appears to have a division of in-house programmers that make licensed platformers about balding middle-aged men with moustaches for the Amiga. I shall have to see if they made it a trilogy with a game based on, I don't know, the dad from the Bisto adverts, Peter Bowles from To the Manor Born, or maybe even Ron Jeremy. Would I play that game? You're damn right I would play that game. The main part of the game is very similar to Allo Cartoon Fun. The smooth scrolling levels are large both vertically and horizontally, and packed with villains and numerous collectibles, some of which I don't know what they do. Who does? Where this stage differs from Allo though is that Shep Ramsey is a truly dynamic, well-trained martial arts expert. And he has multiple attack moves, though it does look ridiculous seeing a super deformed Hulk Hogan pulling off a little version of a Street Fighter II Dragon Punch. There aren't many levels. There's one set on Suter's mothership and 2 set on planet Earth. So that makes it a much shorter game than Allo, but the game is bolstered by 2 factors: other game types and the fact that all of them are harder than the contents of the Iron Sheik's jockstrap when he put Hulk Hogan in the camel clutch during a championship encounter. The first level, for instance, before you even get to the platforming sections, is a Gradius-style space shooter as you fly Shep's little fighter through all sorts of obstacles and aggressors. Some of the enemy ships in this section suffer from that lazy design aspect familiar to many of us who played European microcomputer games in the 1980s. There's not much creativity on display here, with these perfunctory ships performing very average attack patterns. But worse, some of them look a bit like power-ups, and the first time you play you'll probably crash into 1 or 2 of them, thinking that you're going to get some juicy guns or speed bonuses. Another issue though is that you're given a energy bar, which is good, but there's no post-hit invincibility, which is bad, and you can be frustrated as life after life is wiped out in less than a second if you encounter a larger enemy. And yes, it does feature that annoying factor from Gradius and Nemesis and all the games like that, where if you lose a life and you're fully powered up, it's very hard to then finish the level. If you get right to the end of the level and you lose all your weapons and your speed, it's the difference between climbing the stairs of a bungalow and that of the Nakatomi Plaza while it's on fire from Bruce Willis making it blow up by having a helicopter crash into it. Lose a life in this section and by Christ, you better be as good as Daryl playing pole position on that Atari. Was it pole position? Someone correct me. Maybe it's checkered flag. The other game mode is a one-on-one fighter. Such was the trend at the time, but unfortunately it uses the same engine as the platformer. These end up playing a bit like Ninja Hamster or one of those substandard IK Plus rip-offs. The encounters are usually with the boss characters, and they feel a little bit like a Mega Man boss battle, but without the weapons, or the tension, or the fun. The game really doesn't follow the film at all well either. There's no catapulting cats, crushed ripe fruit, or Christopher Lloyd. The references to the movie are very, very low, aside from Hogan, the premise, and the fact that neither are very good. Reviews wise, there's a bit of a range. Amiga Format gave the game a slating with a lowly 23%. On the same page as their LOLO review nonetheless, and that got a much better score from them. Anyway, they said that Suburban Commando offers little in the way of gameplay, graphics or originality, so it kind of makes you wonder why they gave LOLO a much better score, really. Amiga Power, though, gave it a 62, saying it's not nearly as bad as it first appears, but it's still a very, very long way short of being worth £25. Christ, I thought it was a budget game when I started playing it. CU Amiga gave it a 68 and declared that if you're 8 years old and are still pining for the days that Hulk Hogan took on the Nasty Boys in the ring, then you'll find this nostalgic fun. Now, given this review was written in 1993, I think it would be quite hard to find an 8-year-old now that is nostalgic for when Hulk Hogan took on the Nasty Boys. Wrestling is a little bit more exciting now. So yes, I doubt there are many 8-year-olds that remember knobs and sags now. Knobs and sags, of course, are very different things as you get older. So many sags. So yes, another disappointment from old Thunderlips. Maybe not as disappointing as the racism allegations or the sex tape. Please don't look that up. But yes, Suburban Commando, is it worth your time? Nope, not really. Anyway. Space Camp is the tale of 5 school-aged kids going on a summer holiday jaunt to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. They are there to learn about the NASA space program, but also to mimic some of the astronaut training. That sounds like a hoot, doesn't it? Well, it does until the predictable disaster unfurls. The youngest member, Max, befriends a sentient robot called Jinx, something I'm not too sure that NASA has even to this day. After a series of incidents occur that threatens the gang's chumminess, you know the sort of incidents, teenagers getting horny, institutionalised sexism, that kind of thing. Well, it all upsets everyone, and Jinx tries to cheer up his best pal Max by giving him his one biggest wish, which is to go into space. This generous act basically puts all of the teens in a big space rocket and launches them beyond the stratosphere with only 3 weeks of very peripheral NASA training to get them home. Can they overcome their differences and land the shuttle back on terra firma? Yes, of course they can. It's a kids' movie. They're not going to end the movie with a scene of their panicked faces screaming as they float off into the infinite void of space. Space Camp had all of the ingredients to be a successful cinematic stew. The cast features some of the most popular young actors of the time. You've got Kate Capshaw, Steven Spielberg's ex, most famous as somehow being even more irritating than Data from the Goonies in the Temple of Doom film. You've got Kelly Preston, that's John Travolta's Mrs. R.I.P., who is in many major roles during her lifetime with Twins, Jerry Maguire and Nothing to Lose on her CV. Then you've got the great Leah Thompson, who put in a brilliant turn as the lusty mother of Marty McFly, an incestuous storyline that would go on to inspire most porn directors and scriptwriters for things like Pornhub. By the looks of it, how would I know that? I don't know. I know nothing, Your Honour. But her perversions didn't stop there, as she would go on to nearly shag a waterfowl in the great George Lucas adventure Howard the Duck. It's not a great movie, but it's not as bad as everyone says. Finally, you've got one Joaquin Phoenix, then known as just Leaf Phoenix, who was just 12 years old at the time. And we all know about him these days, and not even for bad reasons. He's a bloody good actor, isn't he? Space Camp even had a score written by the greatest living orchestral masterpiece sculptor himself, the musician John Williams. We all know him from Superman and Star Wars and whatnot. So how come, from a budget of $18 million, that it just managed to recoup $9.5 million at the US box office? Well, there was the rather lukewarm response from critics, with the average score on Rotten Tomatoes stuck at 46%. But that's not the full story. You see, Space Camp was released in June 1986. That was just 5 months after the horrendous events of the Challenger accident that exploded above Cape Canaveral on January 28th, 1986, killing all 7 crew members on board. This surely must have led to a very difficult period of pre-release marketing for Fox for the already completed movie. As a parent, you probably wouldn't have been so keen on little Chet or Tori fueling their aspirations of becoming an astronaut one day after seeing the horror unfold in the Florida skies a couple of seasons beforehand. Moving on swiftly from the awkwardness of tragedy to the trivial silliness that is video games. Whew, I was out my wheelhouse then, wasn't I? Crikey. Like I said in the intro, Space Camp was only released in Japan, courtesy of the Pack-In Video Company, who programmed and published this title on the MSX. Pack-In Video Company are a company that have endured throughout the decades in various forms as both a publisher and a developer under various names like Victor Interactive and Marvelous Interactive. They've published a lot of Japanese and Western releases in the Land of the Rising Sun, but they were also the programming team behind the Harvest Moon franchise for Natsume. Space Camp finds the young crew already in space, with all the subplots about teenage hormones and career sexism completely sidelined in favour of a game about steering a spaceship around in space. And quite rightly so for a mid-80s computer game. I'm not even sure how you'd program a game about male privilege in the 1980s on an MSX. I mean, I guess it's possible. I'm not sure how that would appeal to children. The first stage finds the teens in their shuttle being besieged by all sorts of space junk in orbit. Satellites, radioactive meatballs, used tampons, and bottle openers are thrown at our spacefaring youngsters. And maybe I've got those objects wrong, but we do need, as a race, to stop polluting our upper atmosphere with used sanitary products. So let's take these lessons as they come, please. Young ladies, stop aiming your tampons up into space when you wish to remove them. Space Camp's first level has you gliding up the screen in the style of a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up. Only, just like the real NASA space shuttles, you aren't packing ordnance to swat away all the cosmic debris in your way. Instead, you have to dodge them like a cabinet minister would have to dodge questions about Boris Johnson's behaviour, securing oxygen and fuel in your ever-diminishing meters via the acquisition of oxygen bottles and fuel canisters left on various massive and very close together space stations. The game's core mechanic comes into play here, the same control scheme that continues throughout the game. It is a lunar lander type effort that will have you steering your craft with thrusts that use your energy reserves and see you propelled indefinitely in that direction because of zero gravity. The next sequence places you in the spacesuit of young Max as he spacewalks out of the relative safety of his rocket for a spacewalk on the exterior of a space station. The movement here is a little bit freer, with our one-day Joker-to-be drifting across a flip screen environment, grabbing the aforementioned oxygen and fuel tanks, along with batteries, lights, one-ups and space diamonds hidden under access panels. Certain panels will let you access hidden treasure rooms full of points and vital resources, though you may find your view obscured if you haven't brought enough light bulbs with you. It's all dark in there. Now, I wouldn't put those diamonds in your pocket, Hackwin. You'll tear a hole in your suit and you'll suffocate. Leave those things alone, they're too sharp. You're troubled in this level by a close encounter of the worst kind, as horrible monocular alien beasts lurk under panels that sap your energy and then explode in a puff of, fuel? They're not in the movie, no, if you're wondering. Also aboard the space station are some of Jinx's robot brethren, and what a bunch of womb openings these chaps are. They don't cause you physical damage as such, but what they do is follow you around like a lost puppy in a post-apocalyptic war zone. This is mildly aggravating most of the time, but in the tight walled environment of a treasure room, they can literally block you in an enclave until your oxygen slowly expires, which is absolutely horrifying if you think about it too long. Remember, this is a 12-year-old child, scared and alone, fighting for his last breath as he's pushed against a wall by a callous robot, fighting for his last breath in the loneliest environment possible, the endless black ocean of space. Once the spacewalk section is done, you get another shuttle section where you have to steer through an asteroid field, but I really can't go into detail in this as I have barely any footage of it. Sorry. I really quite enjoyed this rather simple, yet not very true to the source material space adventure. It is a shame that it wasn't converted to the other 8-bit formats of the time, really, as I think it probably would have been fairly fondly remembered. For that to have happened, it's very likely that the film would have had to have been a runaway success, and maybe without the tragic events of the Challenger disaster, it could have been, regardless of the critical reviews. Still, I quite like Space Camp then. It has all the fun of the multi-billionaire. But don't think you could go and buy Twitter after playing it. All this then? Signs, Class A drugs, two things that should never meet, and yet, inevitably, they did meet. On the movie screen, in the ZX Spectrum, and surprisingly, in real life. Yes, this curious and dangerous mixture of bear and happy nose dust are no strangers, and you may well have seen adverts for the movie all over the interwebs as of late. I mean, it's probably going to be crap anyway, isn't it? It's our last chance, though, to see Ray Liotta on the big screen, with this no doubt being the greatest of all of his cinematic works. What's the Goodfellas? Is that some sort of frozen pizza? Yes, that's the level of humour I've got today. The 2023 movie tells of a 500-pound bear that goes on a murderous rampage in the American forest after happening upon a crashed drug-running plane and ingesting an ungodly amount of Colombian marching powder. I wish I could tell you more about it, but it hasn't at the time of recording had anything in the way of reviews or even a box office. I think I'm releasing this video the day it comes out worldwide. It might be terrible, but it also might be quite good. The great unknown of the Cocaine Bear movie. It's got Tormund in it, out of Game of Thrones, and the deer kid from Sweet Tooth. And that young Han Solo chap from the movie that is actually one of the better Star Wars films that Disney have produced, in my opinion. Other than that, it's directed by talented actor, director and producer Elizabeth Banks, and it was filmed in Ireland. And that, well, I'm kind of wishing now that I produced this video after it had come out. Oh well. before I get to the game, let's look at the true events instead. Yes, there are some truths in what seems like a very apocryphal tale. It is the story of a corrupt Kentuckian police officer and lawyer turned drug runner called Andrew Thornton. And, well, obviously a bear as well. Thornton was in a plane and did a smuggling drop as he flew over a Georgian forest in an aircraft containing his huge haul of cocaine. So he started ditching the goods, some 40 kilos, into the forest below, with the aim of retrieving his stash a little later on. That's how drug running works, I guess. Thornton realised he needed to keep some of the stash on him should he need a bit of fiscal worth to keep him away from trouble if he couldn't recover the goods. So he decided to strap for 80 pounds of cocaine to his body before putting on his parachute and leaving the plane. That's pretty smart. What isn't smart is the fact that he became too heavy for the parachute and he plummeted to his death, landing in a suburban driveway, probably requiring them to get out the snow shovel at the wrong time of year. But anyway, the good bit, the bear. Yes, the bear. The bear found this dumped package of 40 kilos worth of cocaine, and well, the bear found it very tasty indeed, wolfing down a huge powdery chunk of it, consuming $55 million worth of it, adjusted for inflation to today, in one sitting, or standing very briefly. Yeah, that's a whole Motley Crue career's worth all at once, and that's not good for you, even if you have the strong constitution and weight of a black bear. Within minutes, the bear died of cerebral hemorrhaging, and not to mention respiratory and heart failure. The bear's remains were recovered, now known as Pablo Escobar by disrespectful jokers. Well, he was taxidermied and eventually ended up in the possession of Waylon Jennings, the country singer, who donated him to the Kentucky for Kentucky Fun Mall, which is where you can see him now, and is a sentence that I will never, ever say again. No one else other than Thornton or the bear was killed, which means a lot of the resultant media is talking a load of old baloney. But it is baloney we are here for, and that's on me and you. I blame our parents for this. So anyway, the game. Now you're probably thinking, these times don't add up. After all, my calendar reads 2023, the date on the movie poster also reads 2023, and the Spectrum stopped having commercial releases at a time when one of the last games that came out for it was a Doctor Who game that featured Sylvester McCoy as the Doctor. Yes, this is one of those fan-made games made by a wonderful community of good fellas making video games for computers from the days of yore. Yore means old. A Spanish creator called Asimov has lovingly coded this game with the upcoming new movie, no doubt very firmly wedged in his mind, and indeed he does slightly steal some of the artwork for the front cover. But I don't mind that, and nor should you. He's as excited as we are to watch Cocaine Bear. If you want to play this game, it is downloadable from a website. I will leave the link below. And if you're a good egg, you'll give him some money. You don't have to give him money, but it's suggested you do give him some money. I gave him some money because I am a good egg. But should you download it? Yes, I think you should. It's not a sprawling bear-based venture, far from it. It is compatible with the Spectrum 48K. You shouldn't expect such things. In Cocaine Bear, the game, you play as the eponymous bear, and true to form, he's off his 6 nipples on the old freebase, and you're fueled with a bloodlust of the flesh of the man. You scuttle about multiple screens, roaring and chowing down on distressed passers-by, evading contact with hunters, cars, cacti, and the perilous waterways. Water is normally quite a good place for a bear to go, but not a bear on blow, as salmon are insubstantial meats. Homo sapien flesh is where it is at. Your piloting of the hairy fellow is key to your survival, as you only get 3 lives to deal destruction in this sleepy rural American area. And you'll become all weak and vulnerable if you run out of cocaine. You will be defenceless. Luckily, you can of course find more gack lying around the playfield, because it's all over the shop thanks to that sporadic drug smuggler. There's no particular ultimate purpose to this, other than to survive and chase a high score by chewing on enough bystanders. You think a bear on cocaine has a purpose to its existence? It absolutely doesn't. Once you press a direction, the furry fury will keep moving in that direction until you change it, where he will then move in that direction. Now, this may sound like a control nightmare, and indeed I suppose it is in a way, but in the context of a game where you're controlling a bear that has ingested 40 kilos of cocaine, it actually makes perfect sense, as that bear is not going to stop moving until it has died. It's a twitchy, reflexy murder 'em up with a small but varied map. There are a fair few locations that you can explore as the bear. Well, I say a few, I mean there's varied locations. You go from one screen and you're by the coast, to another where you're in the forest, to another where you're in the mountains, to another and you're in the city. There's only probably about 20 screens in total. Georgia is apparently a very small location with a lot of frightened people in it. Graphically, it's sharp enough and perfunctory, not a stunner, but it's a colourful enough game to grab your attention. And bear in mind, this is the work of just one man. Would it have been a successful full price release at launch? In the year that the event happened, maybe. It probably would have done quite well on the name alone, but it wouldn't have gained very good reviews, I don't think. If an alternative or a high-tech or someone like that, Codemasters maybe, if they'd released this game at $2.99 price point, yeah, I think it would have got good reviews. I think it would have been quite a loved game. It is extremely addictive, this game, and I was playing it long after I'd finished gaining enough footage to use. Very addictive, definitely worth a go. I would say it's an unqualified success of an unofficial movie license. Fast, silly, fun, non-demanding entertainment.
And right now, I would give anything to run my fingers through his feathers.
There are, as I'm sure you're no doubt very much aware, quite a few movies based on Marvel Comics. If you can walk into an Odeon and not see a costumed hero staring down at you from a poster, you've probably accidentally stepped into a time portal like Gary Sparrow from Goodnight Sweetheart and ended up in 2007 or before then even. However, there were Marvel movies before the MCU marketing juggernaut sputtered to life and crushed every other cinematic genre experience into the dirt. And the first one of these wasn't the Hulk, Captain America, or even Spider-Man. No, it was a movie upon which this game was based. Incredibly, it is Howard the Duck. That's baffling, right? I mean, there were a few serialised Captain America shorts in the cinema before this came out, but this was the first theatrical feature-length Marvel movie. Think how much merch Peter Parker's red and blue alter ego shifts, and instead of him hitting the cinema screens first, we got a movie based on an alcohol-swilling, frisky, anthropomorphic waterfowl. A decidedly C, D, E, or even F tier Marvel character. The movie was a 1986 live-action affair about the eponymous alien quacker who has been dragged from his part of the universe to Earth during the mid-80s. Yes, past a duck lady with mammalian breasts enjoying her bath as he was about to have a wank. Imagine that scene in your Lego games, eh? Howard has found himself in this mallard malady thanks to the cosmic experimentations of a team of scientists led by Dr. Jennings. Jennings and his team have not only brought Howard to Cleveland, but also a being known as the Dark Overlord, who immediately possesses Jennings, which makes him into a truly despicable creature. Art imitating life, eh, Jeffrey Jones? Can Howard adjust to his new surroundings, or even better, find a way home? Spoilers, no, not really, and yes. He does this with the assistance of bumbling dweeb Phil Blumblebert, played by Tim Robbins, and also the cool chick lead singer of local band Cherry Bomb, Beverly Switzler. One of the most infamous parts of the movie is the near bestial activity that the movie teases between Bev and Howard, but wisely it backs away from this at the last moment. Actress Leah Thompson, who plays Beverly, had a bit of form going into this, having tried to cop off with her own son in the Back to the Future franchise, and probably should be on the same register as old Jeffrey, if you ask me. Howard the Duck was produced by the then red-hot Lucasfilm, coming off their Star Wars trilogy. It was something George Lucas had wanted to make before Star Wars, as he was a fan of the original comic that was originally created by writer Steve Gerber and artist Val Mayerick in 1973. Incidentally, in the comic, Bev and Howard don't back away from human-duck relations, but well, that's up to her to explain to her parents. Lucas ended up being an executive producer with long-term collaborator Willard Hayek directing. Hayek just sounds like this to me. And well, we know what happened, don't we? It's famously one of the biggest commercial and critical flops of 80s blockbuster cinema. It was nominated for 7 Razzies, won 4 of them, and took a shellacking at the box office, and currently has a 14% approval rate on Rotten Tomatoes. Critics of the movie included slights against the special effects, some of the acting, the weirdly adult elements, and that Howard himself was considered unlikable. Ah, poor Howard. Personally, I have a bit of fondness for it, discovering it on late-night television in the early 1990s. The criticism is, of course, entirely fair, but there is enough magic in there to be watchable. I'd say it's worth a watch still. And here's a question for you. Can you name me a movie that's better that features a down-on-his-luck mutant duck mopping up cum in a sex club? I bet you can't. I would kind of like to watch it if you can, though. And hey, despite this cinematic flop that saw him banished from our screens for many, many years, old Howard is making his way back to the big time thanks to the MCU via cameos in Guardians of the Galaxy and Avengers movies, along with an appearance in the Disney Plus TV cartoon What If, where he marries Kat Dennings. If that isn't making a decent comeback and turning things around, I don't know what is. Have you seen Kat Dennings? Howard the Duck, Adventure on Volcano Island is an Activision 1987 adventure and a sort of follow-on from the movie. Howard is back on Earth, as is a vengeful Dark Overlord. The Overlord has decided to kidnap Bev and Phil and lock them away in his volcanic lair, and Howard is very safety conscious and is aware that this probably wouldn't be very good for their health. So he decides to bring his best quack foo to this sulphurous archipelago to free his chums from their wrongful incarceration. Howard is dropped off on the opposite side of the aisle and has to traipse through the fervent jungle towards his goal, which is a microlight aircraft that will enable him to get to the volcano top. And herein lies the problem. Obviously, this opens up questions on why whoever dropped him off on the end of the island didn't just drop him nearer the volcano. They seem to have put him at the furthest possible point away from the volcano. No doubt someone will have a smart-ass response to this, like anytime anyone brings up the Eagles in Lord of the Rings. And of that, Of course, I welcome those responses. There wouldn't be much of a game. Shut up. The foliage-laden remote paradise is fraught with various dangers, from potentially dodgy natives to quicksand, which, as I'm sure you're aware of, was an immensely perilous substance back in the 80s, but never has seemed to have been an issue since. Narrow rapids present a unique issue for Howard, unique in the fact that most ducks wouldn't have an issue with surpassing such things. You see, whereas Spider-Man is a man who has the attributes of a spider, Howard is a duck who doesn't even have the attributes of a duck. He can't fly and he can't swim. Sure, most ducks can't speak English, manage girl bands in the 1980s or perform martial arts, but Howard as a superhero, come on man, that's a bit rubbish. To traverse this turbulent current, what Howard has to do is find his propulsion backpack. In a normal game that's had a decent amount of time spent on it, this would probably take up the first couple of levels, but this game helpfully puts it handily on the screen next to your starting point. Just use Howard's incredibly nimble leap to vault the quicksand and you've got it. You can now scoot over the water to the other part of the island and continue your rescue mission, albeit with a bit of resistance from the rapids. The islanders will endlessly spawn from these holes and group cuddle Howard like fellas in Kung Fu, or really good friends that make you want to feel uncomfortable. This, as it would me, will make our protagonist feel very socially awkward and he will die from embarrassment. Be quick to kick the savages in the chin and then starve their tribesmen of oxygen by leaping onto their hidey holes to fill their lungs with sand, and they won't be an issue anymore. Within about 8 minutes of play, you should have reached the aircraft, where following a short sequence in that aircraft, you'll be inside the HQ of the Overlord, dodging falling rocks as you inch your way towards him, preparing to bazooka his face off. That part of the game takes about 2 to 3 minutes if you're stopping to eat a Star Bar halfway through. Yeah, the game is about 10 minutes long. It was released at full price and is short of the most coveted demos of other full price games. In fact, if you put it on the 2 lower difficulty settings, you don't even get the end sequence in the volcano. The game just ends with you aboard the microlight aircraft. On the 2 higher settings, you get that end sequence. The multiple difficulty levels at least expand the gameplay a little bit, I guess, but that's the same game essentially, just with the end bit chopped off. Is the game at least fun in its short lifespan? It's okay. It plays a bit like Spy vs Spy 2, or one of those mid-tier 8-bit action adventures like one of the high-tech Hanna-Barbera games such as Top Cat or Yogi and the Greed Monster, but decidedly more blink and you'll miss it, despite those games being a third of the price at launch. It is a little bit difficult for me to recommend Howard the Duck in any of its incarnations, to be honest, on the 8-bit computers, as it's definitely got the air of a rushed licensed game about it. Who knows why this is? I suspect Activision sped up and denied time and money towards the project when they got wind of the movie's likely box office flop potential. Howard the Duck is ducking short, and while I can't say it's foul, I can't hoist in its praises either. Crash gave it a 61% in June 1987, saying it was a slightly above average game, which has sprung from a dreadful movie. Commodore User gave it a 5 out of 10 in February 1987. They reckoned that the game could and should have been a lot better, and that you should pass the orange sauce. I think they mean they want to eat him. Amstrad Action didn't enjoy Howard the Duck's adventure either in their issue 53. They gave it a rather miserable 36%. So that's Howard the Duck then, who's had a few appearances in some more modern titles thanks to the success of the MCU since. But the consensus appears to be that his original adventure, much like the movie, is a load of old duck crap. If you say it that quickly, it works, right? Right? Oh dear.
You ready, Jack? I was born ready.
This was a movie that made me very nervous going through Chinatown in London as a child. I think you can probably forgive my childish casual racism, but maybe not that of my parents for letting me watch a clearly terrifying movie that young. It was terrifying. Parts of John Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China were absolutely bowel movement inducing. The swollen head fella who explodes, the thing that comes through the hole in the sewer wall, the hairy beast that is clung menacingly to the bottom of Jack Burton's truck at the end of the movie, and that horrible, horrible thing made from eyes. I'm old enough now to know that such things are silly and obviously only live in proper China. Do you think that eye thing could get a passport? Are you that stupid? Still, I swear I saw Lo Pan working in the Chinese restaurant near Miman. So, Big Trouble in Little China then, fondly remembered by those of us of a certain vintage, i.e. an old bastard vintage, that had a video game adaptation back in the days of the 8-bit microcomputers, those being the Amstrad, the Commodore and the ZX Spectrum. But what is it doing in this video? Surely Big Trouble in Little China could not have been a flop. It's a cult classic. Well, it was a flop. It's brilliant, but sadly it deserves its place in this series, as sad as that is. A great injustice befell upon this earth in 1986, seeing as Big Trouble in Little China was the 72nd most successful movie of the year of 1986, below the likes of Jojo Dancer Your Lift Is Calling, Howard the Duck, Young Blood, Armed and Dangerous, and even a re-release of Disney's rather dodgy these days Song of the South. So why is that fact an aberration against good taste? Well, let me tell you something, brother, as Hulk Hogan once said. Big Trouble in Little China is a fantasy action comedy that finds Kurt Russell's cocksure truck driver, Jack Burton, finding himself caught in a battle between good and evil. It is a battle between warriors, some with martial arts abilities, some with ancient magic, in a mystical underworld in the catacombs beneath San Francisco's Chinatown. Burton, along with his friend Wang Chi, Egg Shen and Eddie Lee, must prevent this sinister sorcerer Lo Pan from forcibly marrying the green-eyed Mao Yin and plunging the world into an eternal misrule underneath his big, scary fingernails. But don't worry, they do stop that, so you can rest easy. Also starring Kim Cattrall and James Hong, Big Trouble in Little China was directed by the legendary John Carpenter, who finally fulfilled a long-held desire to make a martial arts movie. Originally, the movie was conceived by screenwriters Goldman and Weinstein as a western set in the 1880s, but when Carpenter joined, it was reworked by W.D. Richter to have a modern setting. A problem emerged when the very similar movie The Golden Child was slated to be out that year. Given the fact that starred the never more popular than at that particular point Eddie Murphy, John Carpenter decided to steal a march on his rival and get his movie out first. But ultimately, it was to no avail. The Golden Child made nearly 4 times as much money as Big Trouble in Little China. Is it 4 times as good? It is not. Big Trouble in Little China's piddly $11 million in ticket sales in North America was way below the $25 million that allegedly made up the movie's budget. So disillusioned was Carpenter after this with Hollywood movies that he returned to the independent scene, where he gave us, amongst other things, They Live. So that's not all bad, is it? Luckily, it did a lot better on home video and gained a lot of traction as one of the cult movies of the 1980s. Big Trouble in Little China sits at a 74% on Rotten Tomatoes, with the audience score of 82%, which, you know what, it is somewhere in between there in terms of quality. It's a really good movie. It's aged badly in places, but it's a good hour and a half's entertainment, and you should watch it if you haven't already. Electric Dreams released Big Trouble in Little China in 1987 on the 8-bit Big 3. Just like the movie that bears its name, you're charged with rescuing green-eyed maidens from the creepily nailed Mandarin Lo Pan. You do this as 3 of the movie's protagonists, those being Jack, Wang and Egg. Each has slightly different attacks. Jack will chin people with his fist. Wang Chi is a bit more flashier as he swings his toes about in people's chops, in an aggressive manner, mind. And Egg Chen will sit on a magic cloud and toss around electricity like it's going out of fashion. And it is. When was the last time you saw someone throwing around electricity? You must travel through Little China, through the sewers underneath it, then Lo Pan's headquarters, and finally his wedding chamber where he plans to wed Miao Yen. And if she breaks, his backup is Kim Cattrall. Not too bad. She seems very open-minded in Sex and the City, and she makes a noise like a dog in Porky's when she has sex. So, could be worse. Plus, she has green eyes, and that seems to be Lo Pan's type, and also his key to immortality. There's only 4 missions then, but they do get increasingly trickier to defeat. It's good then that you can find weapons to fight your adversaries, both human and other. Jack gets an Uzi, Wang will make use of a sword on the ground, and Egg Shen's mystical bolts, well, they will get a nice little range and power boost. Only by working as a rotating team will you make your way to thwarting Lo Pan and his creepy plan. They can be switched at any time, and it's up to you to make sure that you feed one when they're looking a bit weaker than the others by switching characters and picking up that food. They will be going through a hell of a lot of a hustle and quite a bit of a bustle, so you want to make sure that they're fed. Big Trouble in Little China has clearly been influenced at least a little bit by Kung Fu Master, given the direction that we're forced to wander, and your moves are used via pressing fire and a direction. Martial artists will make up the bulk of the villainy, though further on, Lo Pan and his mystics will give you all kinds of bother. So make sure you put them to the fist, to the sword, and to the hand sparkle. Big Trouble in Little China, well, it's pretty limited. There's nothing but the trog and the repetitive smashing of faces with very few moves. And the only thing stopping it outstaying its welcome completely is its brevity. It's a short venture, completable in under 15 minutes if you get used to its idiosyncrasies. Hit detection isn't the best, but even if you get used to that and work out when to hit the fire button, your mind will be wandering by its second stage. It's very rinse and repeat after all. Graphically, it's fine, with the Commodore 64 version taking the best in show award, I would say, and the Amstrad definitely showing the Spectrum version's ribs in yet another phoned-in, slightly tarted up version of the Sinclair game's original code. So for me, it's not the best, and I found that I was having an instinctive reach for the off button pretty quickly. After all,
It's all in the reflexes.
CMVG gave it a 6 out of 10 in January 1987. They said that the game quickly becomes repetitive and you end up not really caring if you save the girls or not. Commodore User gave it a 3 out of 10 in May 1987. Big hype about Precious Little is a dull, insipid little game, a pale imitation of the Kung Fu beat-em-ups we've all come to hate. Have we all come to hate Kung Fu beat-em-ups? That's a bit presumptuous of you, Commodore User. This is Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to whoever's listening out there. Just go and watch a movie instead, will you? Good.
You know what old Jack Burton always says at a time like this? Who? Jack Burton. Me.
No voi hitto! Nyt sä päästit sen karkuun. Minkä? No traktori tietysti. Oi. Ei kun perään.
What? 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 Just what is this? Well, this is Uno Torahapuru Muata Marley. And I absolutely said that incorrectly. But yeah, you try better. Uno Turahapuru Muata Marley, aka Uno Turahapuru Moves to the Country, that's a bit easier, probably did relatively well in its native country, and so probably shouldn't be in this series of games based on flop movies. But it did only have 556,519 viewers at the cinema, which isn't many. In fact, it's the lowest viewed movie in this entire series by some distance. I mean, you can tell it didn't have a lot of viewers because, well, they counted the number of people who went into the exact number of people that went in to see this in the cinema. So what is this confusing collection of way too many vowels? Where did it come from? Well, it came from Finland. That might explain why that title really hurts your eyes when you look at it. And Finland, well, that's the place I'd quite like to be. You're so near to Russia, so far from Japan. Quite a long way from Cairo, lots of miles from Vietnam. Thanks, Monty Python. It is the 11th of the 20 movies made from 1973 to 1998, featuring the eponymous Uno Turahapuru. 20 movies that you and I had no idea existed up until this point in our lives. Uno is a Finnish comedic creation by director Sped Pasanen, which is actor Vesa-Matti Lauri described as a clown on a personal decline. Looking at him, I reckon that sounds about right, as long as his decline is utterly terrifying. Look at that face. Uno is, to put it mildly, chief fool in a parade of life's losers. He's a feckless layabout with a sky-high ego, keen to avoid work, slobbing about, and desperate to spend the money of others, including his father-in-law. He's a man with the gift of the gab, despite his scruffy appearance. He sweet-talks his way out of difficult positions with the wife and others, and into the beds of impressionable young women. One country's ridiculous clown is another one's former prime minister, eh? Badunch. There's your political humour for the week. Take that, Boris! Uno's 11th adventure, on which this game is based, sees him track down his estranged in-laws and into a country mansion. His wife's father has purchased the stately property without realising the abode is due to be knocked down to make way for a new highway. So ensues lots of rural jiggery-pokery and countryside hijinks as the Turhapuru clan attempt to stop the demolition. Probably. I mean, I didn't watch it. I would imagine that's what they do. I mean, that's the sort of plotline you get in a comedic film. Hell, they did it in the Yogi Bear film, which was terrible. Why didn't I watch it? Well, where do you even find a 1986 Finnish comedy sequel, 11 movies in, watched by only 500,000 people? Yes, I know the internet exists, but yes, I am that lazy that I didn't bother looking. The production was filmed in just 2 weeks and has a viewer rating of 5.9 on IMDb, should you fancy finding it yourself. And if you do, tell me what it's like. So, the game then. It came out the same year as the movie, exclusively on the grey wedge with the 64K of memory, your old pal and mine, the Commodore 64. It was produced by one programmer, that being Pasi Haitonen, and was released by Amasoft, who, and I'm sure you can guess by the name, are a Finnish game publisher. Yeah, not American like you thought. I mean, why would an American company make a game based on this? The game starts much the same as the movie, with Uno finding a note from his wife Elizabeth on the fridge of his city apartment. Fearing a lonely life in an empty house, he decides to join her in the countryside. Get used to this banging theme tune, by the way. It's very Commodore 64. Make of that what you will. Come on. The game itself takes place over 3 levels based on scenes from the movie. In the first, Uno is ploughing a field, trying to avoid grass tufts, puddles and stones that will make him fall over tea. In the second, the Finnish fool finds himself water skiing, possibly with an eye to jumping the shark like the Fonz, because come on, 11 movies at this point? In the third, Tuhaparu is dashing away from an enraged farmer, possibly because he's scared his flock, ploughed his wife, or bummed his dray horse. I've got no idea. I didn't watch the movie. Have I said that already? The reason I've grouped all the levels together is because, well, they're essentially the same concept. You race left to right, avoiding various obstacles. Think of it as a better version of that Viz game. With less racers, it's just you, Uno, and the open road, field, lake, forest, depending on what level that you are on. It is difficult, very difficult. You will find it very hard to make any progress at all, until you fumble around the finish menu and find the helpo function. Now, the helpo function apparently means easy in Finnish. Look at that, it's educational. You've learned Finnish. For further reading into Finnish, have a look at a video I'm going to put in the link below, which teaches you Finnish numbers. It gets hilarious as it gets closer to 100. It is, even on this easy setting, still bloody hard, mind. Bear this in mind when you play. You might get a bit too frustrated. It might not be up your street. And once you fall, you're shifted back a little bit further in your progress. If you fall again very quickly, you'll be put back even further than that. It keeps the same level of bar that it takes off. Considering all you have to do is press up and down, avoiding the various bits and bobs that get in your way, and indeed in the way of Uno spending his life being a buffoon, it is a very difficult game. You can find sweet spots for a while, but sooner or later a duck or a stone will give you jip. The obstacles are randomly placed each time you play as well, which makes it a little bit unpredictable and at times unavoidable to hit certain obstacles. But these moments are rare. And despite this, it's not terrible. I don't hate this game at all. And for what it is, it's really hard to dislike. There's next to no variety in the game, and it's so very, very simplistic. But once you get into the zone, it's really, really playable. It's got that Flappy Bird factor, which I don't mind in a game about the 11th sequel to a foreign comedy series that I'm never going to watch from 40 years ago. It becomes a quite compulsive game to play, with that one more go factor in full effect. You'll be playing it a lot once you've got into that zone, and then probably never play it again. But for that 10, 20, 30 minutes you'll be playing it, it's a great experience, provided you get past the frustration of your first 2 playthroughs or so. No reviews were available from any of the magazines because, did you think there would be? Maybe in Finnish games magazines, but are there any? I don't know. Anyway, I'll have to go and check out the Uno Turahapuru games based on the other 20 movies, won't I? Oh, there isn't. Yeah, oh well. So yes, don't expect the earth of this hideous oaf, but please do give him a go. Take him to your hearts, why don't you? Who wouldn't want to be this guy in a video game?
Why is there a watermelon there?
I'll tell you later.
The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai has a very relatable premise, I'm sure you'll agree. The black electroids from Planet 10 have set an Earth-destroying bomb, and you, as a neurosurgeon, cutting-edge physicist and lead guitarist of a new wave band, have to stop it. I don't know about you, but I get bored doing that twice a week, and I'm very busy too with all those side hustles. 1984's The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension is the cultist of cult movies. It had a strong lineup of 80s movie stars, with RoboCop's Peter Weller as the eponymous hero, with Clancy Brown, Ellen Barkin, Jeff Goldblum, Christopher Lloyd and John Lithgow in support. As I mentioned in the previous sentence, the titular Buckaroo is quite the multi-skilled individual, and it's up to him to thwart the black electroids from kicking off a nuclear war in Russia. They're not even that upset with us Earthlings, but instead they're a bit annoyed with the red Lectroids led by John Lithgow's insane Dr. Lizardo. You see, Buckaroo, being the devil-may-care polymath musical sensation that he is, accidentally unlocked a doorway to another dimension, which Dr. Lizardo wants to use to get home. Only he's not popular at home, thanks to him being a right bastard. What follows then is 120 minutes of downright strange and often unintelligible high cockalorum that split audiences and critics when it was released in 1984. Creators Mac Rausch and W.D. Richter certainly were dedicated to not compromising on their vision, which left some utterly baffled, but those who were into it were all in. Think of it as an 80s cinema equivalent of Rick and Morty and its tiresome fan base. Buckaroo Banzai has an aggregated score of 66 on Rotten Tomatoes and a Metacritic score of 70%. Less than half of the production budget was accrued by Fox in the cinema, with the studio recouping just $6.3 million from the $17 million budget. However, it's done very well on home media thanks to its post-release cult status, and has spawned novels, comics and even talk of a series in 1998 and the mid-2010s, but this time with Kevin Smith attached. So it's done pretty well. And I don't mind it, it's fine. The computer game was released on a decidedly US-looking lineup of mid-80s computers. The Commodore 16 and 64, the Apple II and the Atari 8-bits, they all got a version of the game in 1984 and 1985, with the European computers of the BBC and the Spectrum arriving late and wheezing a year later in 1986. Think of it as sort of a mid-80s adventure game reverse of what happened in World War II then. I'm going to be lazy today and just concentrate on the Spectrum and Commodore 64 versions here, with good reason, which I'll get to soon. The game was published by Adventure International, who mainly specialised in text adventures. They were the team who put out the Quest Pro games based on Marvel properties like the Hulk, the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man. The Spectrum version was released via the UK arm of Adventure International, who were behind the Masters of the Universe games and the Robin of Sherwood game that I covered back in the ancient times of about 3 years ago. The Spectrum version wasn't released on its own, but instead came out as part of a collection named after the coder called Scott Adams Scoops. Scoops isn't his surname, by the way. You probably knew that already, because he was quite famous for making the Zork series. The Commodore 64 version also had a strange release. The other side of the tape contains the Commodore 16 version, only it doesn't say it does anywhere on the tape cassette, so you'll instead be instructed to flip the cassette should you try to load the wrong version. Buckaroo Banzai uses Adams' well-known verb-noun combination type of gameplay. In terms of a plot line, as I stated at the beginning, and I hope you were paying attention, the storyline differs somewhat from the movie. There's a lot less in the way of taking on Dr. Lizardo and his sinister red Lectoid gang here. Instead, you, as Buckaroo Banzai, have to get your oscillation overthruster sporting jet car up and running in order to transmit cancellation codes direct to the black Lectroids to stop mushroom clouds appearing all over the globe like warts on a pervert's shaft. You do this by exploring the town and locating parts all over the shop. As you can see, it's very much a standard text adventure, and a very functional one. And that's about the nicest thing I can say about it. It works. You see, it's not a very good text adventure at all. Buckaroo just troops around collecting bits and doing stuff. None of the large troupe of the movie's eccentric characters are hanging about the town, so you won't be typing talk during its gameplay. The town is utterly unpopulated. There's not a single soul here. That's not a real problem per se in terms of a text adventure, except for a movie that's based around a silly comedy and absurdity. No one to interact with makes the funny aspect a little bit tricky to pull off. The game doesn't even try to be funny in its descriptions though. Buckaroo just quietly moves about town, utterly alone, quietly assembling his car. That's it. That's the game. If the movie had done that, it probably would have been profitable because it would have cost about 20p to make. You know, just have Peter Weller walking around very quietly, very somberly, just fixing his motor. Sure, no one would have gone to see it, but they didn't anyway. So maybe that's what they should have done. Just have a man fixing his car. And a dire premise for a film doesn't make for a good premise for a game either. At least the Commodore 64 version attempts something along the lines of some visuals. There are some stark, unexciting locales from the movie spotted around, such as the mountain and the Yo-Yo Dine building. They're here, and they give some unremarkable visual context. They're not very brilliantly drawn, but they're here. As opposed to, of course, the Spectrum one, which you've no doubt noticed, clearly does just look like it was made to fill out the Scott Adams Scoop collection. The gameplay is the same, but it doesn't have anything in terms of graphics. In fact, it doesn't even have the temerity to change to a different colour to the Spectrum's default light grey background and black text. There's no graphics at all. Are you telling me that the Spectrum cannot show a couple of pictures? It doesn't even have to be the amount that the Commodore 64 has. This is just a very, very lazy port and probably the least visually appealing game that I've covered on this channel, and I can't see that being beaten. I know this is a text adventure, but Christ almighty, this is a really lazy effort. The game is a pretty decent challenge. It required me, a non-text adventure player even back then, to consult the guide for most of the duration of it. A lot of the puzzles don't make sense to me. I'm sure they do to regular text adventure people, but to me, no, I couldn't get on with it. There are a couple of nice touches. There's some timer-based situations that can put an end to Buckaroo's world-saving attempts. For instance, there's a torch battery and a bomb that both give you limited moves that ramp up the tension a little bit. But that's about it. I'm not having a go at it for being a text adventure. The Buckaroo Banzai franchise probably lends itself, for the era, quite well to a text adventure. It's just, it doesn't really do anything with it. There's no characters or humour at all. It's a good opportunity that's gone begging. It's a bad computer game and a real poor use of the licence. CNVG reviewed the Spectrum version with the other games that came in the Scott Adams Scoops collection. They gave it a 3 out of 10, and the reviewer said that it was his least favourite of all of Scott's games. And there we have it. That's a very short and quick review of what is a thoroughly unremarkable use of a cult movie. Well, thank you for listening to all that gas come out of my face bum. And in the next Omnibus, we're going to be looking at the console versions of movies from the 80s and early 90s. That's something to look forward to, isn't it? But until then, like, subscribe, and Kay, thanks, bye.